The Chester County Historic Preservation Network welcomes you to our virtual heritage series, live at 5 on the third Thursday of each month through the end of 2021. Kathleen, where are we headed this evening?
In tonight's program, Tim, we're going to be traveling to Malvern to explore the incredible story of Duffy's Cut. Presenting tonight's program is Dr. William Watson. Born in New York City, Dr. Watson is the professor of history at Immaculata and also an author of the book, The Ghosts of Duffy's Cut.
Dr. Watson received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and is the director of the Duffy's Cut project. A warm welcome to Dr. Watson.
Thanks for having me here, you guys. Anyway, here's the PowerPoint. Let's see if I can move this all the way over and maximize our screen. Okay, very good. So thanks for asking me to present. I'm happy to talk about the story of Duffy's Cut with everyone today. For those who aren't familiar with it, I'll go over the main historical details and then discuss where we're going with this project. Something that started in 2002 and continues even to this day with the spin-off site in Downingtown. It's a historical and archaeological exploration into the fate of 57 Irish immigrant railroaders who were brought to Malvern in 1832 to complete a mile of track of the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad. And the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad employed contractors to build 1 mile of the 82-mile system at a time. And some of these contractors had multiple miles. Philip Duffy, for whom this site takes its name, had 6 contracts with the Philadelphia and Columbia, as well as contracts with the Westchester Railroad and the Reading Railroad. Duffy was a prolific purveyor of his countrymen. He lived 1783 to 1871, lived a very, very long time. And in the course of his lifetime, would have quite a reputation among the railroading establishment as being an effective contractor. And he would obtain in 1831 the contract for mile 59 of the Philadelphia and Columbia, which was the most valuable contract in the entire 82-mile system. It's one of the few spots, too, one of the few sections of the Philadelphia and Columbia that will have a spot named after the contractor. In this case, however, it's the case of the death of his workers during a cholera epidemic, and we know that some of these individuals, at least some of them, were in fact murdered. Murdered in a time of crisis brought on by an epidemic that no one understood, at a time of increasing immigration and demographic changes in America that a number of individuals and groups might have been opposed to at the time. The section that we're talking about is, you see in the photos here, along the Sugartown Curve, as it's known. The segment entailed building a cut, which is gouging out a landscape to lay tracks as flat as possible, hence Duffy's Cut, but also the fill between two hills, and using the kinds of tools that would have been employed since antiquity for construction, before the days of more modern machinery or dynamite. This was very hard, backbreaking labor, and to follow British labor patterns and British technology, using Irish laborers, as many of the railroads east of the Mississippi did. And the lower left image here shows the fill from the top, so it looks pretty flat. That would not have existed in 1831. That was something that our men were brought over to work on. The photo in the middle on the bottom shows the SEPTA train going right by in the R5 line, the site marked by a stone monument of the burial place of a substantial number of the workers who died of cholera and violence at the site. The far right is the north side of the tracks. The family that owns this property has allowed us to do some investigations there. We haven't, by any stretch of the imagination, really begun to break the surface of what may exist on that property, and we hope to do that at some point in the future. But you can see from the north side the severity of the curve. Um, the top picture is the old print showing the original track line, and it was a horse line, a horse car line in the original conception of the Philadelphia and Columbia. The Philadelphia and Columbia is going to be the first railroad in Pennsylvania, the second in North America, and it was conceived originally as a horse car line, um, and the locomotives that would be in existence in Britain would be imported by the time the line opened up. The whole line opens up in 1834, and there were locomotives, but there were still some segments of the track where people were using horse cars. Um, the idea that the locomotive is very costly, but in the end can go much faster. And the purpose of the Philadelphia and Columbia was to shorten the distance out west in an era of increasing interest on the East Coast in moving inland. You're talking, a couple decades after the Louisiana Purchase, and the concept that the New York and Maryland state authorities had already begun public works to shorten time and distance. The Erie Canal in New York and the C&O Canal in Maryland, and then the first railroad in North America, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. So Pennsylvania, which had once been the federal capital, was the nerve center during the American Revolution, saw itself falling behind in the effort to expand products and move people out west. And so the Pennsylvania state legislature established the Canal Commission. And the Canal Commission would be responsible for what is called the main line of public works, um, uh, rail and canal system that was intended to shorten the distance between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh time-wise to between 2 and 3 to 4, possibly outside days, in comparison with 2 to 3, possibly outside 4 weeks in the days of the Conestoga wagon. And they parcel out these contracts by the mile to contractors who would then be responsible for, as you see in the middle here, this is the contract for this particular mile where Duffy's Cut is located, mile 59, by the amount that is paid to the contractor for removal of gravel, hard pan, solid rock, and so on, a certain amount per cubic foot. And then the contractor then is responsible for hiring a work crew to carry all this out. Typical work crews at this time made at the most 25 cents a day. But Philip Duffy had a contract prior to this at adjacent mile 60 that you see in the newspaper on the left here. This is a Village Record out of Westchester, the ancestor of the Daily Local. And they had a report in here about Duffy's mile 60, which mentions that Duffy was employing Irish hands in the work. It says a Herculean task being effected here by a sturdy-looking band of the sons of Aaron. Very interesting turn of phrase. And it talks in the middle about the geography of mile 60. And then it talks at the bottom about problems between the workers and locals all along the route, and that there had been riots and disorders all along the line caused by the fear on the part of locals that the workers are going to come and damage their crops, damage their fences, and cause other financial ruin. And at the bottom of this lay this economic issue of foreign workers coming in and undercutting local labor. At the time that Duffy's Cut was being created, there were only 910 people living in East Whiteland. There were almost no Catholics living in East Whiteland. There was no Catholic parish to tend to any of these workers. So they were really on their own. Duffy himself would have had very little incentive to make their lives easy, but then again, he also would not have wanted to see them all die. That would have been bad business for him. He certainly wouldn't have wanted word to get out that the men at mile 59 had died. But mile 60 is an indicator that there were problems brewing all along the track line, and there are newspaper pieces elsewhere that report similar kinds of situations. The miles, by the way, on the Philadelphia and Columbia line are measured from Columbia Pennsylvania, which is up Route 30 along the Susquehanna, and it measures those miles westward towards Philadelphia. And the terminal point of Philadelphia, in many, most people's minds at the time, well, this is where the line started from the Schuylkill River and up Belmont Plain to Belmont Plateau and etc. But that was really the ending point in the original conception of the line. That's not how people remember it. But you can see some of the details at the top here about this contract. I don't know why the copyright symbol or whatever this registration, that's not supposed to be there. I don't know why this is saved that way. But anyway, this is information that we've made public in our books, the Ghost of Duffy's Cut and the Massacre at Duffy's Cut. But this comes from the newspaper on the left is the Chester County Historical Society records, which are tremendous. And then the central one and the one on the right come from the Pennsylvania Archives in Harrisburg, which is really tremendous for the Canal Commission documents on microfilm. But the amounts in here are insane because it's, again, a typical contract, 4,000 to 6,000 at the most. This contract is 24,500, way more than any of the other contracts. And this is something for a man like Philip Duffy, who was an immigrant, who was Catholic, but again becomes a purveyor of his countrymen, seen as someone who can actually get the job done with backbreaking labor provided by these immigrants. And when it's finally done, the contract is going to be worth $32,000. That's after the death of our men and the completion of the work in 1833. At right is what we call the Mitchell letter. I'll get it, next slide up here is an enlargement of this. This is the Canal Commission reports. William Mitchell explaining, the superintendent of the line, that Duffy was complaining due to the loss of half of his men, and he wanted money to complete his mile. The loss of manpower, half of a crew. The Philadelphia and Columbia, along each of these contract miles, employed about 100 to 120 men per mile. Depending on the labor, it could go up as many as 120 guys. This was the most difficult mile in the entire 82-mile system. It's the most expensive mile in the entire 82-mile system. And so Duffy wanted more money. And Mitchell makes the interesting comment that Duffy was the perfect master of the art of complaining with or without cause. He didn't think very highly of Duffy as a man. We knew he was a purveyor of his countrymen very effectively, but he did not like Duffy, you could tell, as an individual. But it is one of the early reports out there beyond the local newspapers that discusses the death of the men at Duffy's Cut. It says that they died of cholera because everything that happened, whether the disease took men or whether violence took the men due to a quarantine going wrong. And there's quarantines described all along the Philadelphia and Columbia, all along the B&O Railroad, all along the C&O Canal at the same exact time due to the same causes. They didn't want to have cholera spreading from work camps to the general community. But cholera would spread from the work camps to the general community, and how it got to the men at Duffy's Cut is a curiosity. This is the National Gazette and Literary Register. This is early September of 1832. This is after the outbreak has happened, and it's probably late news. That is, it probably was all brought to a conclusion by this time out at the Cut. Some interesting things are mentioned here about people who were fairly higher ranking in the social hierarchy, if we can say, from the workers here, the locals who were more established parts of the society, getting cholera from poor people who lived in shanties. And so there's this guy named Spear. Everyone is intemperate, they say, in his household. He's presumably one of the immigrants, not the railroaders, but someone else in the community. Intemperance being one of the things that they believe brought you into a greater likelihood of contracting the disease and dying from it. The death of Lieutenant William Ogden, as a result, he's a lieutenant in the local militia and connected very much to Cromwell Pierce, who was an officer in the War of 1812 in the regular army, and descended from someone who had thought very highly of Oliver Cromwell back in Ireland because they named him Cromwell. and would be the local judge. His house, by the way, is a very old house on route on King Road, which I'm trying to think what the road is that comes in right there, but the Cromwell Pierce house is still standing, and we have the opinion that the killing of those Duffy's Cut victims who were brought back in sealed coffins into the valley may have actually happened at the Cromwell Pierce house. Um, Coffins with 100 nails to seal them would not have been necessary for someone who died of cholera. They were designed to enclose the bloody mess inside and not let anyone who would have buried them know that they could take the lid off and see that these guys didn't die of cholera. Anyway, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here. The article also says that the railroad set up a cholera hospital at this site, and there was no such hospital. The Sisters of Charity, who were manning the cholera hospitals in Philadelphia at the time, would be called upon by someone, we don't know who. Maybe it was Duffy, maybe it wasn't, to come and tend to the men at some point after the first ones died and before the last of them died as well. We presume some of the men did die of cholera, but not certainly not all of them, and maybe not even the majority of them. But Sisters of Charity were called upon. They came out and stayed about a day, and they were forced to, by circumstances, to walk back into the city of Philadelphia. They were brought out by carriage, but no one would carry them back into the city on a carriage because of the fear that they may have contracted cholera on their sojourn in the valley. But they were brave, and they came out and they tried to help, and they were encouraged to leave by Duffy, and they did leave. The story, though, of what happened down there would have been buried were it not for a couple of really exceptional circumstances. It was not unusual for a number of workers, a cluster of people as high as 57 to have died of cholera, when you have records in the city of Philadelphia on the worst days of the cholera epidemic in the summer of 1832, of as many as almost 80 people dying on a single day. So this is not exceptional. Over the course of a couple of weeks, the 57 men would have died who were in fact forced to stay in the valley and contract the disease at a minimum. But we have an article from the Village Record, November 7th, 1832. It talks about, it's a retraction or a correction, I should say, by the editors of the newspaper to say that it really wasn't quite so bad out there at mile 59. And it says 8 or 9 people died. So it suggests that there's an article that was written earlier that they say exaggerated the numbers of dead. Now, it is very important to recall that the number of 57 was used by the railroaders beginning in 1909 in the railroad file compiled by Martin W. Clement, the future president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And he got that from railroaders. He didn't make that up. He got that from testimony that he asked for and acquired from a variety of sources within the railroad, people whose parents had worked on, fathers or uncles had worked on the railroad, and they had the numbers. And it corresponds with the approximately 60 people who are listed in the Mitchell letter. Duffy losing half a crew of 120 is about 60 guys. But why the 8 or 9 here? This is something that from the beginning, smelled suspicious to us. And it corresponds almost with the number of skeletons we excavated. We'd be able to excavate 7 within the fill. It's possible that another set of remains was subsequently destroyed, or literally vanished back into the fill. But the 7 whom we were able to excavate did meet a different fate than cholera. Janet Monge, our forensic anthropologist, a physical anthropologist at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, one of the foremost physical anthropologists in the country, has said that if they had cholera, that is not what killed these individuals, that they all met blunt force trauma deaths. She knows clearly the difference between someone who had sustained violence prior to their death or violence being done by natural forces or man-made situations after death, that the mark of a perimortem blow is very different to a physical anthropologist than something that happened earlier in someone's life or after death. And she says that these 7 skeletons all showed signs of perimortem, time of death violence. We presume that the railroad file, by the way, states that when the outbreak happened, that men fled the valley and were forced back in. Well, they weren't forced back in. We believe they were brought back in the sealed coffins, and that the men who were still working in the fill, which is the common custom, to bury people in the fill when they died. And there's an old railroader's song, "Bury me in the fill when I die," and so this is the first known instance of this, but this is a much more common custom in railroading. And this is only the second railroad in all of North America, but the first example of a group of railroaders being buried in the fill at the time when they died. And so Duffy's Cut is important on so many levels, including the beginning of this custom of burying people within the fill. Now, that fill did not predate 1832. That fill was being built by the men at the time. So they couldn't have been buried before 1832. There's nobody buried at Duffy's Cut in the fill because the fill didn't exist until 1832. And after the track line opens in 1834, there's nobody getting buried in that fill because that's an active train line. You're gonna cause all kinds of issues if you were to do that. But there's a very specific time when bodies could have been buried in that fill, and that is in 1832 when it was being constructed. But this newspaper account also includes a couple of other interesting details. One man from there moved up the Valley Creek to the line of East Bradford and East Combe, where he died. That links up with a story that we would find out in 2004 from Samuel Pennypacker's account of the history of Downingtown. That's where this is, what we're talking about on the map today, where Pennypacker talks about another Irish railroader crew who got infected from someone coming in, to their midst, infecting them, and they all died. And we have another Irish mass grave of railroaders we're going to start looking at next week, actually, in Downingtown, where there was also a history of violence, as referenced in the newspaper piece from 1829 about mile 60. In Downingtown, the Irish contractor, an Irish immigrant himself, Peter Connor, was savagely attacked by a local Irishman named Henry Gallagher, who was an Orangeman. It's a sectarian issue. Catholic Connor, Orangeman, Gallagher, Presbyterian, and it was adjudicated in court. And Gallagher happens to have been found guilty of an assault. It wouldn't surprise any of us once we excavate at this site in Downingtown, once our geologist finds for us the exact spot, that there was more violence that happened to these workers in Downingtown. Because you don't lose 100% of victims in any outbreak of cholera. It's usually 50%. And there's as high as 60%. It could go from 40 to 60% in any group. But when you have a recognition by the community, okay, all these guys died, that is preserved in folklore, that's preserved in records, then something else was at work than the cholera, not just cholera. Cholera provided a circumstance for a lot of other issues to be aired. The feeling that the local workers are being undermined by the immigrants, Catholics coming in at a time when nativism would be beginning to appear. 10 years after this, less than 10 years after this, the nativist riots in Philadelphia would see Irishmen lynched and Catholic churches bombarded with cannon. Seems like out of the gangs of New York, but in Philadelphia, not in New York. And the other detail here in this piece to note is that there is an order by the contractor to order the shanties of the workers burned down. We're not talking about shanties as in physical structures like we would think of in later years, but lean-tos, tents, and so on, that were very easy to burn. And we've got evidence of that fire in that valley. We've got vials of the subsoil where all the artifacts would be found that show evidence of that fire. And we've got artifacts that have burned elements on them, so that clay pipes have pewter pieces burned onto them. We have nails that have burned glass and so on, showing that there was a fairly intense fire that was set here. And that was a fairly common custom in a cholera outbreak. You burn the bedding, you burn the stuff that the men had with them. but there's a lot of stuff that was on those bodies of those workers in those coffins. The 7 who got coffins. We don't expect they all got coffins, but the 7 we found had coffins. And there was stuff on those bodies that no normal person would leave if someone had died. A Barlow knife. There's definitely a haversack with one of the guys. We've got the pewter buttons from it. So there's there's a lot of stuff going on here that makes it apparent that this is railroad spin in this article. It was only 8 or 9 guys. Those are the 8 or 9, the 8 certainly within the valley, who you couldn't dispute died there because everybody saw those coffins going back in. The other guys, well, they probably all got dumped in a mass grave. I'll get to the theory. Our geologist speculates where they were buried originally, and they're now relocated in the fill. You flash forward to the early 1870s, 1872, 1873, and one of the guys in this photo is Patrick Doyle. We don't know which one for sure. This is the founding members of the Kennet Fire Company. This is his grave at St. Patrick's in Kennet. He was an Irish immigrant, came over during the Civil War, served in the Marine Corps, came to work on the Pennsylvania Railroad after the Pennsylvania Railroad had replaced the Philadelphia and Columbia as a private company, working out at this spot where Duffy's Cut was located to expand the track line. And in the course of his work, he found skeletons in the old fill that he was sloughing away from the valley to use to expand the track line to the north. And because to accommodate more modern locomotives, you needed a bigger line, literally. So the fill was expanded. And in the course of that work, he found skeletons and moved them to where they are here under this wooden fence. This was the origin of the, the next slide here, the stone monument that was put in place that still stands, put in place by Martin W. Clement right here. In the 1880s, Julian Sachs, a local historian, German-American historian, took interest in local folklore, wrote a series of articles for the Village Record, including the one that you see here that was retyped on the Pennsylvania Railroad letterhead at Martin Clement's orders. It explains that someone was walking down the tracks. We believe the man who was walking down the tracks, by the way, was Isaac Williams. It was his name. Walking from a pub and looked into the valley and saw Irishmen a month after their deaths dancing their ghosts on their graves. And that little bit of folklore is important because the line of sight of this guy walking through the unfinished track line provides a spot that eventually is where the bodies are buried. I mean, we had a physical map of the valley provided by the local homeowners very generously to us when the condos were going up there, and we had an X right where years before we were able to actually excavate, about 5 years earlier. But this bit of information is preserved by Martin Clement because he was living on the site in 1909 of Immaculata, before there was an Immaculata, with the Doyle Donahue family. George Donahue's wife was Bridget Doyle, the sister of Patrick Doyle. And so Clement learned about the story of Duffy's Cut from the Doyles and the Donahues. And he was working as the assistant supervisor for the Pennsylvania Railroad in Paoli at the time. And he took an interest in preserving the Duffy's Cut story. So he created a file right here. And this file, by coincidence, ended up in my family because Martin Clement's assistant was my grandfather. And my brother had this years before, I even heard of the story. I didn't recall anything. He says our grandfather told us about it when we were young. But you flash forward, Martin Clement in 1909, 1911 orders the construction of a stone monument that still stands at the site of Duffy's Cut, where Doyle's wooden fence was and was starting to deteriorate. And so the property across the track, so that's what we have access to now. And you saw some views of before and also right now, looking at from that property over to the stone monument. This is in 1932, 100 years after the incident. And then this is what it looks like today, although there's a green sign up above it instead of the maroon one. And this is what it looks like up close. Those stone monuments were they call them sleepers or sills that are originally affixed the much smaller tracks to the ground. And they're strewn around Duffy's Cut to this day. There's probably 100 of them out there. They're all on the north side of the tracks. There's a track walker Hugh Campbell, who brought us over and showed those to us. It's fascinating. They're very heavy, like 300 pounds. My grandfather, who's the one with the cigar here, was the assistant to Martin Clement over here. My grandfather on my mother's side was Joseph Tripison. Tripsiano was his name. He was a Sicilian immigrant, changed his name to fit in, became a Protestant to fit in. And I'm Catholic. I don't know whether he would be horrified or say, okay, yeah, conversion is a personal thing. But I do work for Immaculata, so it's very good that I am a Catholic. But anyway, it worked out in my case. It worked out in his case, and he went the other way because Clement made him his unofficial historian. And when the railroad went under, my grandfather had risen to the position of director of personnel, the only one that Pennsylvania Railroad ever had before they merged with the New York Central and eventually collapsed due to the highway system and trucking replacing train hauling for a lot of the economy. But along the way, Clement made the file off limits and really kept the ghost story part of this thing to tell some family members. I met Clement's nephew in 2009, right after we found the first skeleton. And he told of being brought into Clement's office when he was the chairman of the board after he'd served as president. And both my grandfather and Clement told him as a child the story of the ghosts. And they said, but don't tell anybody, keep it secret. The reason why Clement might have wanted to keep it secret is because this is bad publicity for the railroad. It doesn't matter that he had some sympathy for the men, wanted to tell the story. But when he became president, he marked that file off limits to the public. Didn't want anybody to see it. Just bad news for the railroad. Well, anyway, the railroad falls apart, again in the modern trucking age, and most of the bundles of documents that were at 30th Street, eventually they ended up at 30th Street. They were at Pennsylvania Railroad headquarters originally, which is not 30th Street, but the beautiful building near Tiernanog, near the Parkway, with the old, beautiful Pennsylvania Railroad murals in it, and frescoes. But and mosaics, and it's just a beautiful building if you ever get a chance to see it. It says Pennsylvania Railroad out front. But anyway, that's where my grandfather worked. That's where Clement worked. And then eventually all the surviving documents ended up at 30th Street for the railroad. My grandfather was allowed to take whatever he wanted from the vaults before it all went up for auction. We have the auction catalog. We know what was in there. There are a lot of miscellaneous bundles of documents. So that railroad file is not listed because my grandfather got it first. If it had been sold at auction, it could have ended up in Idaho or Wyoming, and just as a minor bit of interest. But because it stayed in the mainline area roughly, and I got a job at Immaculata, that's the coincidence of all coincidences. My brother showed this to me after an unusual sighting that I had, and I am not one to believe other people's ghost stories, but I saw something, and I have no other explanation for it. When the houses went up around those condos, and I happened to be at Immaculata at 10 o'clock at night with a bagpipe associate of mine, and we saw something that I didn't know until 2 years later resembled exactly what was in that file. So the guy walking down the tracks in 1832. And I have no other explanation for it other than that. Hence the first book's titled Ghosts of Duffy's Cut. The first documentary is titled by Tile Films, Ghosts of Duffy's Cut, because the folklore kept this thing alive among the railroaders. And it's the folklore that got us involved in this. Immediately when my brother showed me that file in 2002, which is 2 years after I saw whatever the heck it was that I saw with Tom Connor, who's not in this picture, but he should be. We started the Duffy's Cut project. And the first thing was to obtain a marker. And the battle for the marker is an interesting thing. I won't go into all the details, just that it took us a petition with a lot of signatures on it. And there were a lot of politicians who helped us. Andrew Dinniman was hugely important. He was the first politician to sign our petition. And then John Rafferty, who was the state senator, helped make sure we got the marker, with the Emerald Society being the sponsors for us. Chester County Emerald Society Police were the ones who literally paid for it. And now the state, now that it's put up, will be responsible for keeping it up. But we got the approval for the marker. We had a ceremony dedicating it at Immaculata in 2004. And we put that thing in the ground with about a ton of concrete. So it's going to take an A-bomb to take it out. That was done by the three of us over here, myself, Earl, and John. Well, on the same exact day in August of 2004, my brother went down to the valley, and we also got permission to begin our archaeology. And the guy who wrote this to us, giving us permission, Mark Schaefer, was out at Duffy's Cut a year ago, just before the pandemic. And he and his associates began finally. I mean, can you imagine? It's 2020 last year, right? 16 years later, the state is assembling a file in the state archaeology office about what we found, how we found it, and how we're preserving it in the museum. They're definitely they're going to write a very a positive file for us, which is very nice. They saw that how we conserve the stuff in our museum, and etc. But this was an important moment. So we got the mark, and we got permission by the state to excavate, and it was a matter of getting gradually assembling a team, and we get in time archaeologists, anthropologists, and geologists, who's really going to be critical, as you'll see with the finding of the skeletons. Along the way, the research that we did drew it up in 06 into the Ghosts of Duffy's Cut. Now there's a newer book, The Massacre at Duffy's Cut, with all the forensic anthropology stuff and the geology of how we found the bodies. This came out, good God, 3 years before we found the first skeleton. Tile Films of Dublin made the first of these documentaries. It has the same title, Ghosts of Duffy's Cut, and it was the highest viewed documentary in Irish history on Irish state television, RTE. Those guys stayed with us through the finding of the skeletons, and they came out with another documentary in 2013, right after we took the first one who we identified back to Donegal, and after we buried another 5 at West Laurel Hill Cemetery. So Death on the Railroad. This is on in its entirety on YouTube. You can see it. We have a YouTube channel for Duffy's Cut if anybody's interested, with a lot of documentaries and news clips over the years. It would begin to attract a lot of attention in time over in Ireland and here in the U.S. In our course of our research, though, finding the ship was very important, and finding a list of names on the ship record, which is very rare for this early period of time. The luck of the draw here, as if those ghosts weren't reaching out for someone to remember them. The luck of the draw that we were able to find when they arrived. That's in the railroad file. It's the summer of 1832, recently arrived. One ship in this period of time arrived in Philadelphia with a complement of a lot of laborers, and it's laborers we're looking at. Men who over in Ireland would have been working in agricultural labor, virtually as serfs, even though there was political emancipation under O'Connell in 1829. These guys didn't have any real economic equality with the Protestant ascendancy until the time of Charles Stewart Parnell and John Davitt and the Land League. That's the 1880s. So there's another 50 years before they got out of this terrible situation of literally being indentured servants to absentee landlords. And you haven't even gotten to the famine yet in the 1840s when everything got worse. I don't know if you guys have seen Black 47, but that's what was awaiting the kind of situation that film Black 47. If people survive this era, and then eventually, the terrible 25% loss of the population in the era of the famine, and the evictions and forced conversions, to get the soup and all that stuff. But this ship list is really, really unique. We're going to find this in the National Archives. We actually found the advertisement in the Londonderry Sentinel of they call it Londonderry in Ascendancy, Ireland. Catholic Irish will call it Derry. That's still an issue today on the signage. If you've ever been to County Derry, it's fascinating. We would go there in 2015 with one of the skeletons from County Tyrone nearby. But anyway, the ship list here is intact. Very few of these early 1830s ship lists are intact. We have everyone's name. We have the county of origin. We got their ages and their occupations and what very little things they brought with them. The advertisement for the sailing of the ship, there would have had to have been an ad, maybe by Duffy himself, maybe by the Philadelphia and Columbia, come to Philadelphia and work on the railroad, because these guys, some of them had almost nothing with them, and it probably was a decision just like that. I got to get out of here. They would have had experience in manual labor, doing ditch digging, horse teaming, fence making, stuff like that for an absentee landlord. But the Catholics were largely excluded from the money economy. The only place where they could have earned any money really was in Belfast in the dockyards, where the Catholics, like in our valley at Duffy's Cut, were at the very bottom of the fill. They were the guys building the fill. The guys up top, we find out last summer, were Protestant Irish immigrants under the McCartney brothers, John and James McCartney, who finished up top. And we just found this out last summer who the guys were who were working up top, and it was the McCartney brothers. And their workers were never discussed as having been murdered, like the Duffy's Catholic workers. Why? Because they can merge into the population much easier. And anyway, we got 47 guys on this list. Also, okay, they're they range in age from 18 to 70 of the laborers, and you got another 10 guys in this house, which still stands near the intersection of King and Sugartown to this day. The Friendly Sons of St. Patrick, which has been a very generous patron to us, their president, Ryan Heenan, lives in a housing development just on the other side of this property. You've got an actuary institute, and then you've got this housing development, and Ryan Heenan is able to actually walk here and look at this. This is the house that Duffy occupied, according to our tax records, from 1830 to 1832. And he had with him 27 people, including 10 non-naturalized Irish laborers. Now, they would have been working with him right before Duffy's cut at mile 9 of the Westchester Railroad. We have the record of that. Professor Jim Jones out at Westchester found the record in the Chester County Historical Society of mile 9, and then we were able to find the newspaper record in the Historical Society archives that showed that Duffy got mile 9, the terminal mile of the Westchester Railroad, which would have run very close to Duffy's cut. It would have been along King Road. The port of departure for the ship being Londonderry in the records, again the establishment name for the city, named by the planter ascendancy population on the earlier town of Derry, but the workers themselves never would have called it Londonderry. They called it Derry. And later on, we had this information very early on. Talking about 05 time period, we found the ship record. And then we would find the clay pipe stem that you see here, stamped Derry. Now that is, whatever you want to call it, that's context in an archaeological excavation. This is context. This is critical because we know they came from the city, and this is a pipe stem. It's the only one that we found. Found a lot of pipe stems, but only one stamp with a city on it. There's no other pipe stem stamp like this, and really interesting. This was found by our late colleague John Ottes in November of 05. Ulster is where most of the workers came from, according to the John Stamp passenger list. The ship was called the John Stamp. Sailed from Derry to Philadelphia from April to June of 1832. So you're talking about 2.5 month voyage. Today you could fly over in 6 hours. You're there. But at that time it took 2.5 months, and you got really poor, destitute, desperate people on that ship, side by side with people who have occupations. Those people are easy to find in the records. They survive. You're able to find the same names who are weavers or have some sort of a trade, but it's the 47 guys on that list who are listed as laborers who literally will disappear from the record and be buried in that fill, along with 10 of their colleagues, from that property in East Whiteland. Donegal, I think the property today, by the way, that spot is Willistown, where the Duffy house was. Donegal, Tyrone, and Derry in that order, the number of laborers. And this area of Ulster, this is, the province of Northern Ireland. This is the province of Ulster, the ancient province of Ulster, with Monaghan, Cavan, and Donegal having been excluded in the treaty after the Irish War of Independence because they were largely Catholic areas. And the Protestant leaders under Carson et al., from the UVF founding in 1912, they wanted Ireland to remain a Protestant. It has to do with under English control, British control. This is the area, where the troubles would erupt in the 60s to the 90s for good reason, because these groups are competing with each other, the lower ends, the laborers who are Protestant, laborers who are Catholic. These guys leave Ireland, get away from this. The only place they could have gotten money in any kind of transaction would have been if they'd been laborers in the dockyards in Belfast. They had no idea when they came over here that they would see a similar sort of situation existing in the New World. Duffy made it as a Catholic immigrant here, made it, by being able to purvey his countrymen in this economy. And so we actually have this is his signature, nice confident signature. These are his naturalization documents. He was naturalized in 1813 as the War of 1812 was raging on. And this is his burial place at St. Anne's. That we actually have you'll see later on a tombstone that was placed there. And this is the record of his burial next to his son, Francis Xavier Duffy. But he would have a total of 6 contracts with the Philadelphia and Columbia. He had a contract with the Reading Railroad, several contracts with the Reading Railroad, and also with the Westchester Railroad. When we began exploring this, it became apparent to a lot of people in Ireland that they had relatives who came over here and they were never heard from in the years before the famine. It resonated very heavily with the Irish community, and there's art and there's music and there's literature that was spawned by the Duffy's Cut story. We actually have a CD of music. We have a website through Immaculata. It's www.duffyscutproject.com, and you can get a copy of the CD. There's some very important music on there. The music tells the story as much as the historical literature does of what happened there. But the art that was spawned by this is Dave Hollenbach's painting for the cover of the Pennsylvania Gazette, November, December of 2010, where I went to grad school, where John Ottez went to grad school. Right after John died, they came out with a really interesting piece by Samuel Hughes, which is probably the most comprehensive piece of all the things that are written, because at that time we were finding skeletons and Janet Monge was analyzing them. Paul Lynch's Red Sky and Morning is one of the examples of literature. This is a novel. It's one of a number of things that were written on the subject, but this thing actually, he did his research, and John Ruddy, the first of the skeletons we excavated, John Ruddy, the historical character, appears in here, as does Philip Duffy. The art, these are murals from Marty McGee's down in Prospect Park in Delaware County. And a host of other illustrations. We have paintings by, you'll see at the end here, by Fred Danziger that appeared in Sam Katz's Urban Trinity documentary that aired when the Pope was here. We actually have the originals of those with a grant from the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick. I'll show you those later. But there's, again, it spawns stuff that we never would have imagined in a typical historical research story. I mean, my original area was the 7, 8, 900s AD in my doctoral dissertation, and some people are interested in it. It's being translated now into Indonesian, my dissertation, but there really is nothing that I ever thought I would get involved in that emerged, that grew into something like this. That is just a phenomenon unto itself, that we unleashed something here that became much bigger than we ever thought it would become. And part of that is the groups who are interested in this, the fact that there were documentaries made. Labor groups are intensely interested in this for obvious reasons. These guys, did not have a union. They didn't have any way of having anyone to protect them at all. And this group here, the Solidarity Committee up in New York, wrote a beautiful letter that I read at the 2012 burials. The original, a lot of the original press here was Walt Hunter, KYW, CBS. He was a crime reporter for most of his career. He also knew my grandfather, and he did a whole bunch of episodes in CBS News about the evolution of the story. This is where he's interviewing Ron LaBarca, one of the original radar guys we had on the site, and he was there when we found the shanty where the men lived and died. And this is East Whiteland's minutes from when we got permission from the East Whiteland supervisors to excavate, and it was a very exciting moment that night. It was, I couldn't sleep the night before. I mean, none of us could. It's me and John and Earl. We went there, and my brother couldn't make it, but the three of us, we were just like on pins and needles. Would we get the okay? And we were very, very happy when we got the permission to proceed with this, because the homeowners at the time were also very sympathetic and supportive, and they wanted these skeletons out of there. They wanted justice to be done too. There were a number of the members of the condo board who were very, very helpful. This shows the excavations, the various phases. When we found the shanty area here, when Ron LaBarca was involved. And then when Tim Bechtel got involved, the geologist at the University of Pennsylvania, he'd be the way he's actually a geologist to find the skeletons within the fill. And what the fill is what the train goes over today. If you go on the R5 line, This is it on the north side. And you can see that the stream goes through here. The McCartney brothers, who finished top at the cut, were also the guys who built the culvert, which goes over the stream in the western end of the valley. They built that in 1831. They were there before Duffy got there, and they were there after Duffy's crew died and finished up top. This shows the old fill, what was left of it in the eastern end of the valley. The western end all got sloughed away by Patrick Doyle's crew, made into the more modern track line. The skeletons we found were all in here. This hadn't been touched since 1832. Again, there weren't bodies in there before 1832 because this thing didn't exist then. And Tim was able to find that for us. Another really important piece of the context is on display in our Duffy's Cut Museum. This is at Immaculata in the Gabriel Library. We have the oldest example of Irish nationalism. Everyone's invited to come on out and look at this museum. It's in the library on the first floor. And we've been told by a number of people that this pipe is very important. It's supposedly the oldest example of Irish nationalism in North America. 1832, the Erin go Bragh flag. That's the flag of the United Irishmen Revolt, the year that Duffy came here. We don't think this was his pipe. I mean, it could have been his pipe, but it was in the shanty. It was one of the men working at the cut who had this pipe bowl, and we have the stem for this. It's very plain. We don't even have that in the museum. I guess I should put that next to this. But you can see it's the Erin go Bragh flag, the old flag of Ireland. It says in English around it, Flag of Ireland. It has shamrocks all over it. On the other side of this thing is a round tower, which is a symbol of Ireland, from the days of the Vikings and warn of the incoming Vikings. And so some Irishmen put a round tower there, knowing that was the thing that dominated probably his hometown. They're still standing all over the place, from Kells to Monster Boys. Everywhere where there's an old monastery, there's going to be a round tower. And the artifacts that we would find here over the years, we got a lot of these identified for us by John Hankey of the B&O Railroad Museum and by Kurt Bell of the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania in Strasburg. We took stuff to Kurt Bell, and then John Hankey came to us. And so we know that we had the 1830s here, and all the railroad artifacts found in the proximity of the bodies in the old fill. And so again, context, very important. Earliest artifacts that you could find in relation to the railroad. And all those artifacts were found in the yellow grid here. This shows the Greater Philadelphia Search and Rescue crew, whose dogs smelled something here in this spot and began our research in this particular area. They sent us something organic, and that was this burned material dating from 1832. And all the artifacts, most all the artifacts in the museum were from there, with a few exceptions, like the Barlow knife, the buttons, things that were found on the men themselves. Tim Bechtel in December, and this shows, by the way, the grid in more detail. This is in our new book. We may even have this in the old book in The Ghost of Duffy's Cut, but the new book talks about how we dated this stuff, how we found that the skeletal remains, were from a particular time and how they died. So there's a lot more detail in the new book about this stuff as well. But you see the geophysical map here, that you have the rail line here, you have the stone monument here, and you get this rough terrain here. The interesting thing is the skeletons were right here. We just needed the radar to find that out. And Tim's going to get that for us in December of 2008. And this is his image right here, the image on the upper left. This is through magnetometry and electrical resistivity, varieties of geophysical survey data acquired here. And he put it onto a map, 3D'd it for us. And he gave this to us in March of 2009. And I had my students digging in the exact spot he told us to dig. It was literally the Friday after St. Patrick's Day, 2009. We found this guy. And Janet Monge was on board by that time from the University of Pennsylvania Museum. This guy also, by the way, had a pants clasp on his body and also a shoe buckle. This is down at the Penn Museum. We let Janet Monge have some of the skeletal remains for research purposes, and also some of the clothing. She said this is an approximately 18-year-old male. This was the first bone found, by the way, by two of my students, Bob Frank and Pat Barry. And 18-year-old male, there's one of these guys on the ship list. His name is John Ruddy. One guy in the entire world that this could be. Again, there's no bodies in there after 1832. There's no, after the rail line opens in 1834, nobody's dying. There's no reports of anyone dying between 1832 and 1834. And there's nobody buried in there before 1832 because the fill did not exist. So this guy is John Ruddy. There's no one else in the world he could be. 18 years old. Janet Monge says this is about an 18-year-old guy. Anyway, one guy in the world who we'll see in just a second had a very peculiar physical anomaly. GPR surveys found a bunch of other skeletal remains underneath a huge tree, a few feet, 5 to 6 feet to the west of John Ruddy, under this huge 180-foot tulip poplar, gigantic tree, double trunk thing, where it's in the background of this picture here. And by God, under that tree, there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There were 4 bodies under that tree, and 4 skeletons. And here's one of them being excavated. The skull. Usually, for the skulls, the skulls are heavier than the other parts of the body, so the skulls recede back into the grave over time. This one was different. This skull was literally above it, the rest of the body. This is after we found Ruddy. Huge amount of attention. The Irish ambassador would come out. Eventually, we met the Irish president and prime minister. There's an enormous amount of interest in Ireland in seeing this through to the end, and also the story at Northwood out in Downingtown. One man was entirely entwined in the roots of the tree. This is his remains. It was a very unique excavation. This is a 6-foot tall guy who we'll find had a lot of interesting things as well. The average height of these guys is like 5'6". Their average age is 22. But anyway, this guy is fairly, got a fairly interesting thing as well as a skeleton. Here's Janet Monge. Here's Samantha Cox, who was her assistant. Now is her PhD from Cambridge University in England. Here's Tim Bechtel, and there's a bunch of my students and a bunch of Janet's students. And we had the former deputy coroner here with us for, saying that we're, following county rules. And then the Irish governmental interest in this has been enormous. We don't have the picture with Enda Kenny here because we didn't put that in. Here's the Irish president, Michael Higgins. Everybody who is, within the Irish government seeing this as interesting. It's because even though these guys lived in 1832 under British control, they're Irishmen, and they would be Irish citizens today. Or citizens of Northern Ireland, which is of key interest to Sinn Féin. They have provided a lot of help for us. They helped us get the second set of remains over to Ireland, to County Tyrone, which is in Northern Ireland, not in Donegal. The first set of remains, John Ruddy, we took back to Donegal. That's in the Republic. But this is different. This is in Northern Ireland, a whole different sort of set of circumstances. And Pat Doherty took a personal interest in the story. He was the vice president of Sinn Féin under Gerry Adams. Very much a mover and shaker. He's mentioned in Peter Taylor's Provost, and in one of the top books on the Troubles, Provost. Peter Taylor is the journalist who wrote the 2 top books, Loyalists and then Provost, and the BBC did 2 documentary series on the books. Pat Doherty's in there. He's a mover and shaker. And then Linda Dillon was the Sinn Féin mayor of Mid-Ulster. They have mayors for regions, unlike over here. We might have like a county commission or something higher than that. But there's a lot of these Lord Mayors, and that's the position here. But she was Sinn Féin, came to our reburial of Catherine Burns, the woman. Forensic research here on a couple of these remains, very interesting things found. John Ruddy had a 1 in, I don't know what it is, 100,000 dental anomaly. It's called an M1 agenesis. We had a physical anthropologist in Janet Monge. We also had a forensic dentist in Matt Patterson. Both of them are going to help us at our new site, by the way. Matt Patterson's the one that said this is definitely a tooth he was never born with. It's not that he lost that tooth. He wasn't born with it. An M1 agenesis. Well, when this story hit the news that this 18-year-old male we identified as John Ruddy was born without that right top front molar, all of a sudden Ruddy's all over Donegal began contacting us saying that they are also missing that right top front molar from birth. So that is a fairly rare thing. And this is something that we are still pushing for. We have the money now to do the research here. We just need a company like National Geographic or Ancestry or 23andMe to come on board and actually do it. You have to grind up the old teeth to get the DNA out of them and link it up with existing people with, the name Ruddy or missing their right top front molars. We've been sitting on this for years. The original DNA samples we got in 2013, well, they went bad in 2018, even though they were refrigerated. We're not going to use these teeth, by the way, to grind up, because this is an important piece. It's down at the Penn Museum. This is Matt Patterson's X-ray. Janet Monge has the teeth down there. And then this guy, the tall guy, he got an axe blow. His guy, the average height is like 5'6" at the most. This guy was 6 feet, a little over 6 feet. And it took a lot to kill this guy. They all had signs of perimortem violence, but this guy had an extremely violent end. Janet says he was hit by an underarmed right-handed axe blow that took him down, and then the bullet was fired as he was on his knees. That's the theory, because the bullet was fired in close proximity to the skull. There was lead all over the skull. All right. He's got elements of iron here, but around the bullet hole and inside the bullet hole, these are all lead, pieces of lead swipes, he calls it. And the bullet was right down there in his skull. Small caliber, low velocity kind of weapon. And the kind of thing that the East Whiteland Horse Company would have been used to using against horse thieves. Mile 59 happens to have been owned by the Pratt family, who were the leaders of the East Whiteland Horse Company. And aside to that, about the murder issue here, is that in 2014, late in the year, I got a phone call from a guy who said he was a descendant of someone in the East Whiteland Horse Company, and that there is a descendants society that meets once a year between Christmas and New Year's, and between Thanksgiving and New Year's, at the end of the year. And they have an annual dinner of the Descendants Society. He said they had an incident report of this, and they had a list of the names of the members. And he wanted to let us see this stuff. And come January, I hadn't heard from him, and we were planning to take Catherine Burns's remains back to County Tyrone. I called him up. I said, "Look, man, we were very interested in seeing these records." He says, "Nope, they closed ranks. They were afraid of lawsuits from collateral descendants of the Irishmen." And then I had him come out and meet a couple of people, including someone who's now involved in the process of making a major motion picture about this over in Ireland. We're talking about all the big names. I'm not supposed to say which actors, but all you got to do is think of who are the big Irish actors today. They've all agreed to be in this film. Anyway, I had this individual who happens to live in Berwyn. That's all I'm going to say. Meet one of the guys who conceived of the film, and he changed his tune completely. Oh no, there's no evidence, that we have of this situation. He wanted to wash his hands from this because the guys in the Descendants Society convinced him, and he told me to my face that they changed their tune because they were afraid of collateral lawsuits, but descendants lawsuits. But the excavation continued till right before the reburials of West Laurel Hill, because that tree, that enormous tree, still had portions of the man from the roots still entwined in it. If you look closely at this picture, this is a very strange picture. Sam Hughes of the Penn Gazette has subsequently looked at this and thought this was very interesting. There's definitely an appearance of a skull there, as very naturally forming within the bark. I have no idea how that's even possible. Al Dawson of our maintenance crew finally cut the tree down, and Joe DeVoy from Tellus 360 in Lancaster, who had a huge interest in the story, actually got an earth mover in there and popped out the stump, and it was on the bottom of that stump that we found the last remains of the man under the tree, so he could get buried all intact. The rest of that tree, Joe is still planning on making musical instruments. You got to cure that wood for a number of years, so I don't know where that is in the process, but I'd love to have an instrument made of that wood. He's going to call it 57 brand instruments. Burials at West Laurel Hill. West Laurel Hill came on board and offered to allow us to bury 5 of the skeletons there. It's interesting that at West Laurel Hill, there are a lot of people who are mentioned in the Pennsylvania Railroad file on Duffy's Cut, also buried there. People who weren't the poor laborers, but people higher up, who offered some information down the line. And then Immaculata came in and paid for a Celtic cross. Tom Ford, the vice president at the time, came through in a very big way for us. This is one of the major things with Duffy's Cut, along with the historical marker and then the marker over the stone monument. This is out at West Laurel Hill, right near the front entrance. And Abbey Rose designed the cross, a company called Abbey Rose, and it's Kilkenny limestone shipped in from Ireland for the purposes. And our pipe band played. The students were the pallbearers. Bob Frank handed the coffins down to Bill Dorn of West Laurel Hill, who's an Irish immigrant himself, and he made the coffins. He also made the coffin for John Ruddy back in Ireland. And he really just shrink down over the years. The bodies fit in here. There's no muscle mass, obviously. There's nothing holding them together. So it's shocking, actually. when you see what you're reduced to after 180 something years. We had an auxiliary bishop there, the Donegal Society. Lots of members of the Irish community were there. We had local politicians involved as well. And Andrew Dinniman was there, who was the first politician who signed our petition for the marker at Duffy's Cut. I remember John Ates and I visited him when he was councilman. But in 2013, we got the okay to bury John Ruddy in Donegal. It had been a plan of ours from the beginning. Vince Gallagher came through with the grave in Holy Family Church's cemetery in Ardra in Donegal. Canon Austin Laverty was the priest presiding. The whole town came out. RTE, Irish State Television, covered the funeral. We had a lot of press along the way, but this was really kind of amazing that it was hitting the big time in Ireland. And the members of the Ruddy family were all donating their DNA. So that's what we got to get to. And I still am astounded that it hasn't been done yet. It's one of the many frustrations. Things move like a glacier. We had the coroner at the time, Stephen Dichter, write a letter for us saying that the skeleton was not harmful to Irish soil. That's kind of crazy, but you had to do it. And we got a tombstone for him as well. Shovelin Funeral Homes over here provided the stone. Shovelin, an ironic name, but whatever. 2015, we got a portion of Catherine Burns back to Donegal, back to Tyrone, excuse me. So this was in Northern Ireland. We the help of Sinn Féin here again, and the idea that you needed a separate kind of protocol if members of the Northern Irish establishment came. We had a Northern Irish flag, provincial flag we're going to put in, and it's just like, okay, are they going to come? They never came. It was it was the local community, but it was a very heavily attended ceremony. We had local historians there from the Ulster Folk Park, Paddy Fitzgerald. We had Sean Beatty, very important Donegal historian, was also at our 2013 burial of John Ruddy. And members of the Philadelphia Irish community went over there. Members of the Donegal Society were there. Even the Vince Gallagher and his associates who had given us the graves for in 2013 for John Ruddy were there for Catherine Burns. They had a wake for her. It was incredibly meaningful. There's a whole bunch of musicians in that parish. This is St. Patrick's Church in Clonoe, Coal Island. It's a section of Coal Island called Clonoe on Lough Neagh. Beautiful little community, and very, very much involved in the troubles. I mean, there's a whole IRA section of the cemetery. We got Celtic cross, looks like it's 1,000 years old. You look closely, they got Armalites on it. Oh my God, guys who had escaped from Longkesh and got killed there, in their escape. And then there's the Clonoe ambush that happened right in the church parking lot. SAS guys took out a bunch of provisional IRA guys who had shot up a police base. And the priest here, though, was really tremendous. This is Father Benny Fee. He's now a canon as well. And a beautiful cross was placed there. And we had an amazing, amazing ceremony. We thought at that point it was all done. But then Joe DeVoit came back because we thought Tim Bechtel got us this image of where the others are. And it appears to be 20 feet down below the surface. And, how could we do that? So we got the equipment from Joe DeVoy to actually drill down and find in some of these core samples examples of bone around the stone monument. The problem I saw, though, right away was we couldn't get the coordination of the contractors and the geologists on the scene. So I was sure as these cores were being drilled that they were in the wrong place, and they were. So they didn't work out. That was later in 2015. 2016, we had an NEH grant. We had teachers come in from all across the U.S. to put Duffy's Cut in the curriculum. And this has been one of our goals from the beginning. They were from all across the country. And we have John Hankey here at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania explaining the early railroad technology. This is one of the first locomotives. There's also a diorama in this area where the cursor is now that shows the track construction. We had that out at Immaculate in 2014. I actually had some of my students helped me lift this monstrous thing. It's a case. It's a diorama showing how the early track line was constructed. It's a beautiful diorama, though. It's now back on display right near here, right near the locomotive in the Railroad Museum. And it shows you the backbreaking labor that was involved at the time. This is Tim Bechtel in the Valley showing these teachers the archaeological technique. This is Janet Monge and Samantha Cox down at the Penn Museum explaining the forensic anthropology. And they actually put skeletons down in front of people and said, this is how a physical anthropologist finds out how someone died. And they were the bodies that everybody worked on. I worked on one too, just because I was one of the instructors in the whole thing. And I wrote the grant. I was the project director. But they were ancient bodies. And you can see that these people were murdered with blunt force trauma, just like the guys at Duffy's Cut in 1832. And then the spread of this throughout a variety of media. There's a lot of books. There's a lot of other documentaries too that came out subsequent to that. The Travel Channel, Mysteries at the Museum, covered our museum in an early episode of their series on Discovery. The Science Channel's Secrets of the Underground did an interesting segment on the science. Lots of books have appeared. Tim Pakuga is a big-time Irish historian. He mentioned persecution, and even, the case of murder and covering things up, and the famine plot. The history of the railroad, the history of nuns, talking about the Sister Margaret McGinnis's books, talks about the history of nuns, talks about the sisters out at Duffy's Cut. There's just a whole bunch of books that have appeared, some of them crazy, like the ghost books. But they do mention our ghost stories. So the ghosts are a part of this. The folklore is definitely a part of it. And Sonia Shaw's Pandemic, which seems like such a good read, a horrifyingly good read in the beginning of our current pandemic. But there's a lot of other books and again, documentaries as well. The appearance of another sign. This is the one that's up above the stone monument today, paid for by the Amtrak IBEW members and the Ancient Order of Hibernians Division 25. So this is what's out there near the track line now. So if you go west along the tracks, you'll see this, or east along the tracks, you'll see this. And let's see, do I have the Duffy grave in here? I thought I had the Duffy grave in here. Oh, no, I don't. The last thing that was supposed to be in here was the placement of the Duffy grave. And that was in 2018 at St. Anne's, to put St. Anne's Parish into the bigger picture of Duffy's career, and how it links up Philadelphia with the story out here in Malvern. But literally next week, we're going to be starting out in Downingtown with our geologists' geophysical survey. And so we'll get subsurface images of the ground, hopefully that will show stuff like this, in these cluster of skeletons in a portion of Northwood Cemetery that at the time was a potter's field. We hopefully will go back to the cut. And there's also a site in Spring City of Irish canal workers we want to get to. And if I ever win a lottery, we're going to do this full time. And forget all the grading. Oh, so I'm done. Here and Tim and Kathleen, you guys can just take the rest of the, ask me the questions or however you want to do it.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Watson, for that tour de force and squeezing all that information into such a presentation. We do have a couple of questions. I know we're over time, but many people are sticking with us here because of your very engaging presentation. So maybe I'll read the first question and then I'll hand it over to Kathleen, if that's okay. So someone asked, how many of the 57 men have been found?
We found 7 skeletons so far. We know where the others are. We'll jump to that last one of those last slides. This is Tim Bechtel's geophysical survey of the spot around the stone monument. And what he's looking for when he's looking for these skeletons is what's called a stopping void. And a stopping void is where there was something solid and then it has deteriorated and fallen to the bottom of this void. And so it gives an appearance to the radar survey that something is there, but it's not stone and it's not something, that's completely solid. And it's typical of graves. And he used this technology on French and Indian war sites out in the western end of the state and found other skeletons before Duffy's Cut. But it's kind of, it's been for him a kind of textbook example of how the science can find something that is otherwise undetectable. And so we found an enormous stopping void under the stone monument. And it's a matter of getting there. There's just, it's a large enough anomaly to, it's kind of crescent shaped, actually, if you were to look at the entire thing around the stone monument and leading north across the track line. And so there's some skeletons we will never be able to get to because it's simply too close to the line or under it. But Tim Bechtel has a former graduate student working in Amtrak at 30th Street, and she went out there on her own and did a little survey under the tracks. And yeah, this is an enormous anomaly. And it's because the track line expanded again. At the time that Patrick Doyle found the first skeletons, Tim Bechtel says that this is clearly a case of skeletons being moved. That there's no way that these bodies were originally in coffins anyway, and that they'd be very degraded in their current state compared to the skeletons we found in the coffins. But he thinks that this is a large enough anomaly that clearly you could have 50 other skeletons down there in a degraded state, but still, you'll find pieces of skulls and things.
Dr. Watson, our second question relates to a picture that you had of you and others standing around the historical marker. And the question is, why was everyone looking so happy at this sad sight?
Let me get back to that picture. That was because this one right here, because it was a battle. I don't want to go into the entire story, just that we needed a petition in order to get this. And we were told we weren't going to get this marker. We were told point blank when we applied for it. That was the, you have to get a local entity to sponsor it, and you have to get a local politician to approve it, because you can only have one per, I don't know whether it's state representatives district or state senators district, but it's all politics. It's all about patronage, to get these markers. And you can see every year what gets a marker. And I cannot tell you what kind of battle it was to get this marker. This was the hardest thing we ever did. It was at the beginning of this thing. And so for us, this was like our Iwo Jima moment. We got this marker for these men. And the joy that we felt was because this could have been us. All right. My grandmother, Jane Donnelly, her grandfather, her great grandfather rather, came over and died here in a horse accident. It could have been anyone along that line, including me or my son. All right. The average age of these guys was 22, excuse me. My son was then 18 and not even 22 yet. It could have been anybody. It could have been any of us. John Ruddy was 18 when he died there. But their story was lost, forgotten, ignored. This was a deliberate attempt by the railroad to plow this under. They were literally buried in what they were making. They hoped that nobody would remember these guys. I know they'd be happy that we remembered them. And we were happy that we got this marker for them. And so that's the reason for the unbridled joy we felt when we got that marker. And the Emerald Society cops who paid for this thing, they paid the $4,000 to get it manufactured. The state is now responsible for keeping it up. But when this came into the police station, Chuck Crawford was the detective, and it was, what's the jurisdiction right across from the Marchwood Shopping Center? What's the police jurisdiction, right? They have if you go up, that back road from Immaculate up to Marchwood,
it's West Whiteland, maybe.
It's like a Welsh name, I think.
It's like West Whiteland. I think it's West Whiteland. It's
something like that, yeah. And so as soon as this thing came in, into the police station, he called me up. I went up there and I saw it. What are you gonna do? You're gonna give each other a high five. Say, my God, we won. Well, I'm gonna tell you how much of a battle this was. When we got this marker, a month later, I got a call from two anthropologists at Bryn Mawr College, Phil Kilbride and Noel Fleming, who had us come out and talk to them. It was myself and my brother and John. How did you do this? And we said, what are you talking about? How did we do this? They said, how did you do it? And we said, well, we had to get a petition. We had to get, no. How did you do it? They thought we got funding for this. Now, we had no funding. It was our wallets. We call it the MAC grant, is how we funded this. and had to get outside people to donate their services. And we hadn't even started the dig yet. We're just getting this marker. They said, well, that's interesting because they knew that there were a dozen other cases in Pennsylvania of Irish stuff being ignored by the state government. Do you know that the Molly Maguires, okay, there was a movie about the Molly Maguires, right? Richard Harris, Sean Connery, Bill Daley, all kinds of famous people in there. It's in all the textbooks. Well, our stupid government in this state did not grant a historical marker for the Molly Maguires until 2 years after we got this marker. Okay, there is a kind of no Irish need apply. We're not even just talking about historical markers. We can talk about all the projects that don't get funded by the state, because these two anthropologists from Ireland who are working at Bryn Mawr College said they had a list, they gave us this list of projects that were declined by the state government. So if I feel like I have a chip on my shoulder and everybody else involved in this does, it's for good reason. We had to get a petition with 4,000 signatures on it to get this marker. So yeah, you better believe we were smiling there. I was elated. And it could have been my story there, written 180 years earlier if I was the unlucky guy who ended up there. Or any of these guys with Irish heritage. It would have been us. It could have been our sons. So that's the reason. It's seemingly, yeah, I don't know. I mean, the Irish have a tradition of laughing at death. What's a wake? What goes on in a wake? The wake for Catherine Burns that we had in 2015 over in St. Patrick's in Clono. They were singing, they were making merry. They brought out little, everybody had a little swig of whiskey. You have to. It's a different culture, maybe than some people are familiar with. But this. You better believe we were laughing. We weren't just laughing. We were like, thank God.
Bill,
Tim, I'm just going to jump in here to follow up with what Dr. Watson was saying about the Tyrone. Was Catherine Burns one of the workers?
Yeah, this is a crazy story. So when Janet Monge told us that there was, this is SK007, Skeleton 7, I found her with John Ottez and two of my students, Jim Casper and Eamon Alwell, on the hottest day of the year and 2010. And my God, a couple days later, John Ottez died. It was a crazy couple of days there. But finding the skeleton was insane. And then in the excavation that was filmed by Tile Films for Death on the Railroad, it was me and Bob Frank, the guy who found the first skeleton, my student over here on the far left. We excavated her. And we didn't know it was a woman at first, but the skull was incredibly well preserved. We had an artist who wanted to do a 3D rendition of this, which still hasn't been done. Maybe they could do it from the photograph. I don't know, but the skull's been reburied. There was pelvis. I lifted the pelvis out of the ground. It was very heavy, and it was very intact. And it was because of the palate, the pelvis. Janet Monge says this was a woman, and she said it was an approximately 30-year-old woman. And when we got back to that ship list, it was easy to figure out who this was. There's no one else in the world this could have been, because again, nobody's put in this thing before it existed, before 1832. There's no one put in there after the rail line opens up. This is Catherine Burns. She came over here with her 70-year-old father-in-law. Okay, father-in-law. So she was a widow. There's a piece of ghostly folklore from the original owners of the property right above where this is. Someone saw a ghost of a woman in black, and we didn't think until 2015, right before we went over with these bones to County Tyrone, that the woman in black, if there is such a thing as a historic memory or an echo through time, if whatever folklore is a whole department in academics, and almost all the stuff they look at are ghost stories, that maybe this is connected to the ghost story. But this was a woman, approximately 30 years old, is 29-year-old worker, not a laborer, but came over with a 70-year-old worker, her father-in-law. And so the women who would have been employed along the railroad would have been doing laundry work and cooking. And it was a very common thing to hire people from the ships who were connected to the workers who would have done laundry work and cooking. The fact that she was also murdered shows how cold-hearted these guys were. When the railroad file says they escaped the valley and are forced back in, they were brought back in sealed coffins, because she, along with every one of these skeletons we excavated, had coffins with 100 nails used to seal their lids. You don't need 100 nails to seal any lids. That's absurd. They were only sealed because They were brought back in to be buried by the workers in what became the later custom of burying people in the fill. And then it seemed like they just died of cholera, and that there was a bloody mess inside there was completely lost on the people who were burying them. Crazy, huh? So when we took her back to County Tyrone, we have no idea where in Tyrone she came from. We have no idea where in Donegal where John Ruddy came from. We just needed a grave. And so we got that grave again through the agency of Pat Doherty and the guys at Sinn Féin. And no, I'm not in favor of anything during the Troubles. I'm not in favor of any one side or the other, and that's bloody sectarian conflict. But these are the only guys over there who care about this story and helped us get this grave. All the people who are the pallbearers here, with the exception of Earl, but he's wearing a kilt. All the women are wearing, well, she's wearing a dress. They're all Catherines from the parish who are carrying the coffin. For them, it's very meaningful. We actually, with another grant, we're able to buy the video footage of this that was made. A guy named Sean Taggart, who was getting his master's in public history. He made it for part of his thesis, a video documentary on Catherine Burns and her reburial. And so we have this. And if I had all the time in the world, I would play you Father Benny Fee's sermon, which is just like hits home.
Dr. Watson, real quick, just the last slide that you showed finally put the word murder on the sign, which hangs over the site, right?
Yep.
And so along the same lines of what you're talking about, it took all that time, and I'm having dealt with the PHMC, I'm sure the state wouldn't let you put the word murder on the blue sign at Sugartown, but the sign that is over the site now is that sign, and it includes the word murder, right?
Yeah, that's really important to us. I mean, when the proposal you were very helpful, and thank you very much, and your comrades for helping us put this up at the time. The IBEW guys who are in the AOH, Ancient Order of Hibernians, Irish Nationalist Organization, of which I am also a member, by the way, the division in Delaware County, Blackjack Kehoe, named after one of the Mullen McGuires, takes this stuff very seriously. It's not to be whitewashed. It's you don't Disneyfy this thing. You don't make it in this, like a cartoon version of history, which you so often see. These people were murdered, and it should be included in the sign here. And finally, it was also, where the counties are that they came from. There was one of the workers from County Leitrim, which is not. It's right next to Ulster, but it's right outside of Ulster, and one of the workers came from there, but. These other sites that we hope to get to, we should be able to find out whether murder was done to those people as well. The thing to keep in mind here is that there are 10,000 examples of individuals from Ireland who died in the 1820s and the 1830s here in the United States, east of the Mississippi, building the canals and the railroads, everywhere from the Erie Canal in New York to the New Orleans Canal in Louisiana. There are 10, and everywhere in between, including Duffy's Cut, 10,000 anonymous people who, whether they died of the disease, whether they died of violence, they all deserve to be remembered. And they're just little footnotes on a lot of the textbooks, if that at all. How does the Industrial Revolution ever get explained in the textbooks, in the big picture? Not with human stories like this. It's always charts and diagrams, maybe a Gustave Doré engraving or two, but never the humanization of a dehumanizing experience, which is what this was for these people. It was literally, they were literally buried in what they were making, and the Erie Canal and the New Orleans Canal. And we have other sites in Chester County. Northwood is about to start. I expect you'll be hearing about that in the months and the year to come. Because I believe we're going to find that mass grave, and we're going to find evidence there of violence as well. The contractor himself was assaulted by a local Orangeman right before that contract was completed, and I'm pretty sure we're going to find evidence of murder out down in town as well. There is a similar organization of the East Whiteland Horse Company operating out there, and one of the people in the there's a connector in the form of a Dr. J.M. Pugh, who is listed as having been the physician at the supposed cholera hospital in this story. He's a shareholder in the railroad. He's a a contractor for the railroad. He's a physician. He also happens to live out in the area of Downingtown, is involved in this emergency committee, as they would call it, which had the similar kind of function as the East Whiteland Horse Company to keep order in the area. And the only order they're worried about is whether or not, these guys are going to be damaging property, or whether or not they did or didn't, is the question. Yeah, we'll find out. We're certainly going to find that out. And then we hope to circle back to the cut. And there's another site up in East Vincent Township, north of this area, maybe 20 miles to the north, where in Spring City, there was an Irish canal workers group also buried in a mass grave. And like in Northwood, in a cemetery, both at Northwood and in East Whiteland, in Spring City, the Potter's Field area is surrounded by tombstones. So it's like a rectangle area where there's nobody buried, and they knew not to bury anyone there because there's a whole bunch of bodies there. So we hope to do that. We've gotten letters from people in places as far away as West Virginia, Tennessee, Maryland, with Irish railroaders from later years in mass graves along the tracks. We've heard from, this is crazy. I think underneath our feet, almost everywhere we go, there's mass casualty sites. On Route 252, the Radnor Paper Mill House site. It's I guess it's a county site. And it's a place where Hungarian paper mill workers died in the middle of a black diphtheria epidemic right before World War I. I think you're talking about 1912 time frame. And the people there asked us to come out and look at the site. And some of my students who had experience in material culture were able to identify a sluice gate, remains of a sluice gate. And there's, some things we were able to do to clean it up. But they've got a bunch of Hungarian skeletons underneath the ground there. You think the Hungarian embassy might get interested. You think there'd be somebody out there trying to do something. We don't have time to do it. Someone should. We were contacted by someone in Devon, Westover Park, which is a bird sanctuary, kind of close to Devon Horse Show. Westover Park, it's a place that in the early 1930s was the site of an Italian work crew in a fireworks factory that was blown to smithereens. And no investigation, no archaeological work there. I went there with one of my students. We were able to find the initial crater, and there were pieces of very old clothing there that were not, they didn't just float there. I don't think there were, any encampments or anything there. This was just untouched. Out in Berwyn, Howellville is a site. There was a branch line that went up to Norristown, and the local historian there said, "You guys need to come out and look at this. There are some old graves, crude stones, put up as what appeared to be grave markers along what is right now a walking trail in Howellville. Whatever was there that we had the chance to look at, we couldn't get to it. It's now completely paved over, and there's that kind of rubber stuff like at Spotsylvania Battlefield where there's a walking path to make things easier for joggers and stuff. There are probably bodies under there. Those things sure as heck to us looked like tombstones. We couldn't get to it. There's just not time. Yeah. But I think under our feet everywhere, there are these mass casualty sites, and that's the reason for the persistence of ghost stories over the years. I don't have any other explanation for, what we saw other than that there was some sort of connection to what my associate Tom Connor and I saw back in the year 2000 when the houses went up around that mass grave at Duffy's Cut. It would have made no sense for me if I looked at that file and had not had the the experience with whatever it was that I saw, that those guys those ghosts dancing on their grave at that particular spot would have meant nothing to me. I don't know. I'm not an advocate of these supernatural approaches to history at all, but I know, and I have never seen anything before or since, and I don't believe any of the stuff that people want to spout on television, around Halloween about ghosts. But I think these guys were crying out for help, and I think that's the explanation we have. Somehow they knew we had that file in the family, and it took 2 years to put that together. But that's how we found these skeletons at Duffy's Cut, and no one involved in the dig doubts for a second that there wasn't some supernatural agency involved in it, that we were guided to where we were. There's a cop who helped us out. There's a bunch of police who've helped us out. At Downingtown, we're going to have Matt Gordon, who's the captain down in Kennett, who helped us get the marker. And we had Bob McAllister, who's a park ranger. And there was a guy from up in New York, Jim Kane, who came down to help us. And he noted that before we found the first skeleton in the valley, we never heard birds. We never heard signs of life down there. I don't know. But after that, all of a sudden,
maybe there was a very unknowable reason, but important reason why you were the person who saw that vision.
I believe that's the case.
Yeah.
And my associate Tom Connor believes it too. Now, he came with us on both of those burials, even though he wasn't involved in the dig. You don't want to talk about coincidences and weird things in life. He got off the plane in 2013. I made him come with us because he saw the ghosts. Okay, he was the guy who called me to the window. He got off the plane in 2013 en route to Donegal. We were driving up there, and he whipped out this family history that his mother gave him. Go visit your great grandfather's grave. It was a few rows from where this was. I mean, he didn't know the name of the cemetery. He didn't know the name of the church. There's a reason for this. It's crazy, that there could ever been a coincidence in that. I mean, I don't know.
Another coincidence, Dr. Watson, is that my paternal grandparents are from Tyrone.
Ah.
And I had run into the name of that one immigrant that was affiliated with Duffy.
Right.
That I had sent to you. Yeah, I think that it's more than just coincidence.
Absolutely.
What is the name of your new book?
The new book is called Massacre at Duffy's Cut. And we go so far as to say that, even though we only have 7 skeletons, because those 7 skeletons were all murdered.
Okay.
But yeah, it's called Massacre at Duffy's Cut. And there's a huge section in there on the forensic anthropology and how Janet Monge figured out that they were murdered and what all the artifacts mean in context with that.
All right. And we're going to close here and say to our audience, we hope you enjoyed tonight's program as we explored the incredible story of Duffy's Cut. Special thanks to Dr. William Watson for the exceptional program and his unwavering commitment to this cause, and to each and every one of you for tuning in this evening and making this CCHPN Virtual Heritage Series program possible.
Our CCHPN team looks forward to seeing you all next month on Thursday, April 15th, live at 5, when we explore Preservation 101, Historic but Not Significant, a program that will feature housing stock built between 1940 and 1970. Details and registration information are available on the cchpn.org website. Have a fabulous evening.
Stay safe, enjoy the last of winter, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.